Hi, Chelsea. How are you?
I'm good. How are you?
Should I do a different backdrop or just not do a backdrop at all?
I like the backdrop actually. What is it a picture of?
There's apparently a weird weather phenomenon called an horizontal rainbow. And this happened in the Northwest, like in Washington State or Oregon.
Yeah,
And so a photographer got a picture of it earlier this year, and it looked really cool. So I thought I used it as a backdrop.
super cool. Yeah, I'm from Seattle, so yeah, I kind of. All right. Yeah. So thank you for agreeing to do this interview with the Houston Asian American Archive. I'm just going to be asking you a couple questions about like your early life, your education, career, and then some additional topics with some special questions about the current COVID pandemic at the very end. So yeah, today is May 11th. 2020. I am Chelsea Lee, and I'm here with Kevin Nguyen. And so the first question is, where and when were you born?
So I was born here in Houston, more on the suburbs side. Specifically, I was born in Clear Lake, Texas. But then my family immigrated from here from Vietnam, and we moved all over the place in Texas. And then had a brief stint in New Jersey, and then came back to Houston.
Yeah, so can you describe like the neighborhood and community that you grew up in?
That's a little hard to answer because
Yeah.
by the time I went to college in 2003, that was already my ninth school growing up. So I went to a couple elementary schools in Katy, Houston proper, spent a year in San Antonio, and then 5 years in Atlantic City, New Jersey. And my parents got a little homesick during one of our spring breaks, and so we went to go visit Houston, and we moved back in 1998, and I went to middle school for 1 year in Spring Branch at Spring Oaks Middle School, and then went to high school all 4 years at Springwoods High School in Spring Branch ISD. And then when I went to college, I went to Baylor, which was in Waco, Texas.
Wow. Yeah. So how has like living in so many different places kind of shaped your childhood and growing up?
Well, it's kind of sucked. I mean, just to be honest,
Yeah.
only because just coming from a duality perspective, like you want this whole Western ideal about coming into America, and then kind of having all of those American dreams or Western dreams to like be fulfilled within your own upbringing. And but when I grew up and got older, I realized why we had to do that. Because then my parents were immigrants from the Vietnam War. And so they had to become refugees in neighboring countries. And so my mom ended up in Malaysia with my aunt. And then my dad ended up in Cambodia or Thailand. And so when they immigrated here and got sponsored, they ended up in different states. So my mom ended up somewhere in the Midwest, Missouri, Minnesota. I want to say Minnesota. And then my dad ended up in Oklahoma, and then they got married in Texas. So within that, like they already grew up with such a non-linear livelihood that they got kind of used to it. And so when they became full-fledged green card holding citizens, they started doing chain migration for other family members. And while other family members were coming in, we eventually had to find jobs and sustainability for all of them. So the next route would be to move to New Jersey. And so when we moved to New Jersey, we lived in Atlantic City because understanding now from an older perspective that like casino jobs are a lot easier to obtain because of the fact that you don't need as much education. Because then my family had to either hold back or forego a higher education because of the fact that they had to leave a war-torn country. So even my mom to this day can't apply for jobs and say that she has a high school diploma because her high school actually burned down back at home. So a lot of my family are very smart, very resourceful, and so they knew how to at least do the math and some of the statistics on how gambling works. So it worked out that we lived in Atlantic City for 5 years, and so some of my aunts and uncles still live in New Jersey. But then, like I said, my family came back to Houston um, during a spring break during 1997, 98, and they got homesick because a lot of family came over on boats together. And so they had a lot of friends that became family with the immigration process and then visited them and got to miss home a little bit because Houston was a big hub and also a good safe space for Vietnamese transplants and then becoming Vietnamese Americans, and that's why our Houston population here in Houston is so strong in Vietnamese, because then a lot of Vietnam War folks left and then came here, and then also the weather kind of matched up with Vietnam with the humidity, the port city, some of the trade also, and so it was nice that my parents came back. It was nice to come back to Houston. I liked New Jersey, but then I really don't appreciate the cold as much.
Yeah. So would you say you have like a favorite of the places that you've lived?
I would say all of them have their own fond memories, but I'm still very much a Houstonian at heart, which I love. Because then I also picked up a little bit of Spanish, because then that's kind of part of the community and population here, which is always so interesting. Because then, let alone some of the stereotypes and some of the microaggressions that Asian Americans receive while with other community members is that like they don't always expect you to know so much English. Then they don't also expect you to know so much Spanish either. And so it was really cool. And I think in itself, it was good for growing up that I was able to be more flexible or versatile because then uh, while going to college, I was away for only 3 hours since Waco is a 3 hour drive. But then I was also close enough to visit home. But then when I went to grad school, my graduate program was in the outskirts of LA in California. And then before my grad program, I took a year off as a hiatus between my undergrad and my graduate program. And so I lived in Thailand for a year and was an English teacher. And so traveling was already set in me and kind of not as much of a deterrent compared to others. So I kind of like that aspect of it. It kind of sucked that I didn't have as much of the longevity or lifelong friends that some people have. But in the long run, in the future, I did build very strong relationships here in Houston and still keep them here too.
Mm. Yeah. So growing up, was it just your parents that you lived with, or?
For the most part, so I have two other siblings, one older brother, one younger sister. So I'm the middle child. My parents wanted a girl on their second try, but they got me. And 5 years later, they got my sister. So they got the best of both worlds for the most part. And we lived together for most of our time growing up. There was a brief stint where we lived with our grandmother and some of our uncles and aunts in New Jersey because of the fact that we were all transitioning from Texas. And so uh, funds were limited. And circumstances were the way they were. But the nice thing about being Asian or being in our culture is that we're very collective, and so we still hold out for each other. And it makes sense to live in a house with multiple generations. So it was very supportive. I always felt like that. But then once we got more established, then we got a place in New Jersey. And but then even then, just how the government was, or just how the market was, we ended up moving 3 or 4 times up there. So we're just kind of used to moving and transition, which, like I said, still instilled a good foundation just to be uh, adaptive, and then also understand that some things aren't going to be permanent. So then for my family, the same thing happened, and especially with the war, and understanding that was what really gave me my foundation and my own personhood to see where I'm at.
Yeah. So did being like a middle child kind of give you any like unique perspectives?
Uh, no, not necessarily, because my brother and I are only a year apart. And so we were treated very much like twins, because then my brother and I are the oldest within our generation. So then our other cousins and stuff, we were the oldest, so we were always treated to make sure that we took care of them and watched out for them. And then the only difference I would say was just growing up gay, and then that's a different kind of perspective and lifestyle mode that I'm still kind of navigating with my family, because um, in Vietnam, there's usually two religious perspectives normally, and that's going to be Buddhist or Catholic. And so the Spanish and also the French colonized Vietnam for a while. And so they brought with them Catholicism, and some of that was also some of the factors for sponsorship for my family. And that's great. But then they're not very big on the whole sexuality aspect, because then part of even our culture and in religion, part of growing up in adulthood is to have a family and procreate. And so the hardest part was, um, I call myself the golden black rainbow sheep, because then it's kind of hard where, since I was a middle child, I also had to fight or make myself more relevant, or at least given attention, because of the fact that I had to fight the attention of a youngest sister, and then also um, compete with the oldest brother, and who's in most Asian and other people of color cultures is going to be the male heir or male dominant person that is in the family line. And so being gay doesn't help, but it gives me another perspective and also a lens to kind of see where my family was coming from. Uh, a lot of it more was running away, and that's why I decided to go to Thailand for a year. I studied biology when I was at Baylor. I tried to fit some of the Asian American stereotype of becoming an Asian doctor, and I did fine. I was good in my studies in math and science, but in itself wasn't very much a vocation calling for me. And so I think if I didn't have the gay obstacle or perspective either, that I would have probably been more in this cognitive dissonance to figure out where I was or who I was in terms of my family and myself. But since they weren't very big on the whole gay side, um, I was able to kind of get that early on in high school. I tried to come out when I was 15, 16. I was given an ultimatum of either going to college or becoming a Catholic priest and making a vow of celibacy. Uh, I went to college. And it was great. And then so I also understood that it's kind of hard for them. I did go through this moment of disdain or contempt for my parents, but unfortunately, I also understood my role as an Asian son, um, and also as a Catholic son. So, the fourth commandment is honoring your father and mother. And same thing with Asian culture is to respect your elders and also the generation that before you. And so, um, it took a while, but then with good support from friends and social groups, I was able to kind of come to terms with it. We kind of have a don't tell policy in my family, but I feel like communicating and also connecting to other Asian Americans, that's very commonplace because then there's certain things that whole Western and Eastern divide brings into our dynamic that it's kind of always hard to bridge.
So, as you mentioned, you were raised up Catholic. Do you think that really like shaped your life, like growing up and even like currently?
Oh yeah, definitely. So um, while in New Jersey, we spent 1 year in public school. I got in a fight. My parents weren't very happy about it.
Mm.
And so they ended up putting us into Catholic private school. So um, I actually was pretty gung ho about Catholicism. So I was a choir boy, I was an altar boy. I also was a Knight of Columbus, which is the fraternal society for men of the Catholic faith. Um, it um, really kind of builds you up a lot where you need a faith structure, and so um, I really understood that more later on when I moved overseas and got to experience that on my own while living in Thailand. Because then while in Thailand, um, I got easier access and cheaper access to visit other countries. And so during my stint in Thailand, I got to visit Vietnam, Cambodia, and China. And so my parents have still to this day haven't been able to do a big family reunion with my brother, my sister, and my parents. But since I was given the opportunity to be over there, they were like, "You need to go visit." And so I went to go visit. I got to see a lot of how they were raised and brought up in the environment they were in. And so understanding that a little bit more and understanding their faith uh, journey was where it a little bit more stronger and closer to them. And also going to Baylor, Baylor being a Baptist school, was also an interesting perspective because then a lot of Protestant faith Christians don't always see Catholic Christians as the same. And so already knowing that divide or that dynamic, because it's just being like this same idea of being Asian American, you kind of grow up either defending it or foregoing it. And then so on my side, I decided to defend it more because then I really do appreciate a certain aspect of having the universe or whatever higher being kind of be in control. Because then um, uh, I've been given this question a couple of times too, where how do I feel about the Vietnam War when historically we know that it's kind of an unjust and unnecessary war. But if it wasn't for that war, I don't know if I would be here because my parents wouldn't have actually immigrated. And so it's kind of a double-edged sword where you want to get that perspective and also kind of understand kind of how the ripple effect works. And so I would say in my faith journey, I still identify as Catholic. I'm just not a good practicing Catholic.
Mm.
But at the same time, it has really instilled who I was and who I am, and also kind of also understanding my parents in another perspective where yes, they don't really appreciate or kind of really understand the homosexuality or LGBTQIA circle. But a lot of the argument normally is if your parents are coming from a faith background, then they should love you unconditionally because you are a gift from God, and um, if they have conditions, then they don't truly love you. But then if we go with that argument and reverse it, and if I have conditions on them, then how am I being any much better?
Mm, yeah. So, what were your the occupations of your parents? I think you mentioned the casino, but it wasn't exactly.
Oh, yes. So my mom and dad have done all kinds of jobs. So just to survive. So we were latchkey kids. So they worked full time just to like support three kids. And my mom currently is a stay-at-home mother. And then my dad is an electrician. And so it's an honest pay, but they're hardworking folks, which I actually appreciate and love about them. One time, and my dad has a great network of folks in Houston that he works with, and sometimes he's actually given a lot of appreciation because of the fact that he's so honest and like since he grew up the way he did. And so one time he actually got $100 tip from someone, and he said it was too much. And I really appreciate that about him because then he knows the struggles of how life is and what it was being an immigrant with cultural barriers, language barriers, and whatnot. But he would never take advantage of another person. He has his own set of values and perspectives about certain communities, but all in all, uh, he means well. And so does my mom. My mom has worked in retail. She's done manufacturing stuff with computers. All in all, she still just wants to be a family person. And so that's been the biggest thing that I really appreciate about her. And my dad is just that he's a patriarchal kind of person. And so he's the youngest of 12. And then my mom is the middle of 8. And so they're used to being around a lot of people and a lot of family members, but also being supportive. But my dad, being the youngest and a male, he also understood his role in supporting family based on um, his status. And so he had to grow up a lot faster or a lot quicker than most other folks that I would imagine or have been exposed to. And so even though age is just a number and there are societal roles, he holds them true and he also follows through. Because then um, my mom's side of the family came over first in the 90s and early 2000s. And then my dad's side of the family started coming over in 2007 and 2010s. So even when they came over, he found them jobs, he put down payments for their homes, and made themselves established because he wanted to be a supportive family member where he could be that resource and that rock, which I like, which you can only respect.
Mhm. Yeah. Did your parents have any like expectations for you when you were growing up?
The biggest expectation is to do succeed and not squander away, I guess, the advantage or the privilege of coming to the States. Um, I think I've done that. I just haven't done it in their eyes or their terms, which is kind of unfortunate. I have degrees. I have a bachelor's in biology, bachelor's in health education, and a master's in college counseling and student development. I've worked with the University of Houston as an academic advisor, and I've been with them for 9.5 years. I've supported family, I've supported friends. I've been a good example in the LGBTQ community. I was voted as Volunteer of the Year last year, which was cool. But it's not really up to their standards because it's not what they want. As then, unfortunately, if I was recognized in a church community or more of a heteronormative role, then I think they would care. I actually am on the LGBTQ advisory board for the mayor. I've actually shown them pictures with me and the mayor, and they're impressed, but at the same time, they're not sure why I know the mayor that way because I don't really explain my role. Because then and once I explain it, then it becomes all these other things. Um, but all in all, I think also they want me, and I think a lot on my dad's side, since he is from a patriarchal or more male dominant perspective, is that he just doesn't want me to be attacked or ridiculed or any way, because then it does bring on to him how he sees himself if he's not able to support his own children. And so I don't want to put that on them either. And so I think they had expectations. They still do. They still want me to get married and have children and create a family and also be an example to the other family members. But they also just have a very tunnel vision about how they want to see that. Because then there's only certain blueprints or an outline of how they see it. And then, so unfortunately, some of my cousins have been able to beat me ahead of time in a way based on that perspective. But I think all in all, we're all expected to be a little happy, but also supportive of our family members as well
Mm.
and not lose touch of our culture. That's the biggest thing about my family, too.
Yes. Um, okay, now we're going to kind of shift into the topic of the immigration of your parents. So, when did your parents first immigrate to the US? And also, I think you mentioned the Vietnam War as being like um, what prompted them, but can you go more into specifics about that too?
Uh, I don't know much. They didn't tell me until I was in college, because then when I became an adult, they were able to share more about where I was coming from. Because then I think when I was younger, they wanted to make sure that they had that parental and authority figure role played out. Because then it was really interesting. Because then I think a lot of my family and friends would make the comment that my sister and my brother and I were a little deprived growing up because we didn't get as much freedom or uh, privilege to do much outside of the purview of my parents. But I think it's also because of safety. My parents had to leave Vietnam in order to find some sanctuary and become refugees. And so um, my dad ended up somewhere, like I said, in Cambodia or Thailand. Actually had uh, to leave a lot of his siblings so that because he was one of the youngest. Because then once you become 18, you become part of the government because you're an adult. And then once you become an adult, the whole immigration process is a lot more difficult and a lot more hurdles to go through. And so um, he willingly was able and going to leave his family for an unknown certainty about whether or not he can get them over to the States. But this was the best like best advantage that he could have. And so same with my mom. Luckily, she had her aunt, my sister, her sister, my aunt, to go through the whole process with her. And they came over in the early '80s. Um, my mom ended up in the Midwest. My dad ended up in Oklahoma. But then they had mutual friends in Louisiana and Texas. And so they convened or got together back in Galveston. And my parents met for the first time and went on a date. And I think it was a bad first date.
Oh.
My dad ended up not having his wallet, and then ended up my mom paying for the date, and he was pretty embarrassed by that. And so um, he didn't talk to her for a while, but then they had another mutual friend, and then they were having a house party, and they met again, and then reconnected, and then uh, jumped over that hurdle about not that paying date thing and got married. And then I think also with the whole immigration process is that you really realize how much you need support or need someone to be with you while going through all of it, because then it's a lot. Uh, I know my dad has seen some people pass away or not survive that transition or the trek over here. I don't know much about my mom's side. She doesn't really share that much. But then it makes sense because then they're in, let's see, they're in their 30s, late 20s, early 30s. And at that point, they also need to establish and make themselves uh, some kind of footing in America. And so they got married in 83, 82. And then my brother was born in 84. And I was born in 85. And then they waited 5 years and they got my sister in 1990. And then from there we went from there. But we were the first ones in my family side to have children, and so I think the rest of the cousins and uncles and aunts started following suit because then we needed to establish ourselves here, um, outside of the understanding that we probably wouldn't go back home.
Yeah. Do you have any like particular stories of your from like your family history or like your ancestors that you were told? Like,
Not much. The ones I have now are the ones really when I personally went over to Vietnam, because then I really got to see where my parents grew up and where they were coming from. I really still cherish that opportunity because of the fact that there were family members that knew all about me. And um, it was funny because then I was going from Thailand to Vietnam, and the airplane ticket was $75 easy. And my dad told me that he told some family members that I was coming, and I saw 8 hands just waving in the airport,
oh,
and it was really cute. And then I actually talked to them, and I was like, "I don't. How did you know who I was?" And they're like, "Well, your dad still shares stories and pictures of you, and I I don't really get to see that side of my dad very often. My dad is pretty stoic and doesn't like emoting too
mm,
much,
mm-hmm.
being, I guess, an Asian male. And so it was kind of touching that I knew, like, I didn't know that he shared all this information about me. And then one sad aspect was with chain migration, I kind of understood my understanding of politics because then a lot of the chain migration and sponsorship side when my dad became a citizen was that the paperwork is just like long and kind of a lot of bureaucracy. And so the family members that were coming over in the 2007 and 2010 era were waiting for like a decade. And so one family member opted out of not being put on that list. And when I saw them in Vietnam, they still bring it up and like kind of have this regret that they didn't really try to opt in because they thought it was just such a long process and it seemed like it seemed insurmountable that they weren't going to be able to do it. But then when other family members start coming over, that's when the regret really kicked in.
Mm,
And so my cousins that don't get to see their cousins that they grew up with um, are kind of upset because then they're like, Uncle, well, why didn't you opt into this? And the uncle is now just understanding that it sucks. And but at the same time, I mean, in another perspective, you just kind of see um, you don't have as much foresight to do that because then the process is just so long. Because then once the United States hits their maximum, then the process happens again next year, and then it goes by the same number amount, and then they have to like if you're number 1,000 and they only do the first 100, then each year they just have to keep trudging along the line and then going from there. And I really got to appreciate what my dad did for his family. He stuck it out. He's always persistent. He can be stubborn in a negative sense, if you call it that way, but he's persistent. And um, he's helped these family members and grow up. Uh, I unfortunately have to be a little bit more distant with them because then um, I don't want to share too much about my life with them because then it would go to my parents, and especially with the whole gay aspect. But in all, like it's still instilled in me to like be there for other people, and so that's why I've been involved in so much in the gay community, and also been, I guess, an example of support. Because then I would say I've been gotten a lot of recognition for what I've done and the volunteer work I've done. Unfortunately, I just can't share it with my parents. I share it with my siblings, and they're very proud and very appreciative. But kind of sucks that I can't share it with them.
Yeah. So we're gonna move on to the topic of your education. So from my understanding, you attended Baylor University, Azusa Pacific University, and the University of Houston. And
Yes.
at Baylor, you got a BS in biology with honors on the pre-med track. So what compelled you to like choose this major and pursue pre-med at first?
Well, kind of the same idea is that like being around so many circumstances where people are just going bad, like you just want to help people, and so it's hard to kind of put that into one thing. But also growing up with parents that had to work minimum wage jobs or just um, or or work under the table kind of deal, and then you want a job that also has some kind of stability and longevity, and so medical was the best option. Because then I always joke with my friends that like there's four choices being an Asian American, and it's lawyer, doctor, engineer, and then disappointment. And so apparently I chose number four. But I think all in all, they also understand that like your offspring should support your parents as well. And I understood that. I really wanted to support that and give into that notion. But then um, I realized throughout my undergrad program that I just wasn't very much into it. And so, yes, I was good at math and science, but I also wasn't very keen on being committing myself into more years of medical school debt and kind of following this cookie cutter roadmaps that my parents had. And then so, but the only thing also is that you can change majors, you can kind of have an epiphany and go through a different route, but I only had a 4-year scholarship at Baylor, and being a private school and being so into much, being halfway through my program, it just made more sense to complete it. And so I completed it. Unfortunately, my parents are still like, you still have an option to go to medical school. I just don't want to. And so I did promise them I would do more schooling. But in that same promise, I said I wanted to take a year off. And so I took a year off when there was an opportunity to teach in Thailand for a year. It was through the Baylor program. My parents were a little upset about it because they were not very happy that I applied to this Baylor Teach in Thailand program. They tried to ask me or try to see if they could dissuade me. And unfortunately, they made me too independent. and, and so they were worried about funding, they were worried about the transition. They knew how it was to like be crossing that ocean and then also be in a realm where we didn't have support. But then I had my ticket paid for to and from Thailand for the year. I had housing. I only had to pay for utilities. And then I already did Skype interviews to land a teaching gig, which gave me a monthly stipend for a year and with a month's paid vacation. And they, there was no argument to have for them. And so it's really funny because that's a funny story I tell my friends and family too, where um, my parents were like, "We hated that we made you so responsible."
Yeah.
Uh,
Um,
I liked education so much, and I kind of touched on doing some college administration stuff. And so I was in student government for 3 years, boosting up my resume so that I can be ready for med school. I did a couple organizations and was an officer in some of them. Uh, but then student government was the most pivotal or most influential aspect. Made some really good friends, also got to be a little bit more um, different than some other med school people. But I got to meet the dean of students and some of like the administration there. And I really liked the education aspect. And so a friend of mine in the honors college went to this grad program at Azusa. We talked about it. And since she was a year ahead, because I took a year off, she told me about the program, what she liked about it, what she wanted to do with it. And then I really liked her perspective. She's someone I trusted. And since she was also a year ahead, I got to use her books and also save a little money there. And then um, I applied to the program while I was in Thailand, moved back or flew back from Thailand in May of 2008. Spent a month in Houston and told my parents I'm leaving to live in California for 2 more years. Uh, so the other joke that they say is that, were you ever going to come back? Are you going to come back and live in Texas? But it was nice because then I wanted to, since I lived in New Jersey, I've seen the East Coast. I really wanted to see the West Coast. And also with the West Coast, it was a little bit more progressive on how they viewed sexuality and their population. Also with the Asian community, there's a big Asian community in California. There are also a lot of gay Asians, and so like it was kind of cool to kind of check that out. Also without my parents being too close or too intimidating, where they might find me or see me. Went to grad school, loved it. Did an internship with the Career Services Department the first year at Azusa, and then moved on to a part-time position at Caltech. And so math and science in the STEM field has always been a foundation of where I'm coming from, but it just relayed or presented itself in a different way. And so I have been a biology, biochemistry advisor for UH, a STEM transfer advisor, and now I specifically just focus on technology freshman students. And so I liked that I've been able to meld that background also with my upbringing to like help other students do what they want to do and figure out what they want to go to. And sometimes it's not the route they want, or sometimes it's the parents that have an influence. But luckily, I've been able to navigate that and also tell students and their parents that there really isn't a cookie cutter or one size fits all. And so it's been kind of nice. And I really like where I'm coming from there.
Yeah. So from your resume, you seem to be like very dedicated to education and like mentoring youth. Would you say there's like a reason for this?
So I guess because coming from a perspective where I think Asian Americans are successful in a way, they're seen as that with the model minority like template, and then with also the idea that we're given the positive stereotypes of like overachieving and also this other stuff. I think it really hits on home where once some people don't fit into that mold, or the fact that um, we can't always break away from the ties of our parents because there's either financial, cultural, or even like psychological restraints to really break away from that. And then sometimes that's why I got into this, because then I want to be um, somewhat of an advocate, a resource, and an example so that students and young adults can move forward. Going through the whole coming out process, wasn't very accepted to my parents, unfortunately. And then with the whole Catholic side too, and kind of being on the linear, mathematical, logical kind of progression. So A to B, B to C, so that means A to C. Uh, so in my younger days, I was a little bit on the suicidal side. And so with my parents not accepting the whole coming out process, and then with Catholicism saying that if you're gay, then you're kind of just destined for hell. And then my understanding also was that if you commit suicide, you also go to hell because then you're foregoing the like most biggest gift that God can give you, which is life. And then once you take it in your own hands, then you just don't deserve heaven. Unfortunately, since gay was lumped into that same kind of perspective, I went through a dark moment in high school, in my teens, and then didn't succeed, luckily. And I think that was also a big turning point because once you hit rock bottom, everything's up. Any other obstacle, any other complication or impediment in life doesn't seem as bad as that time when I was in my teens. Because then I was so stuck in that mindset that I understood that there was no way of winning. And but luckily, going to college and also meeting new friends and also new perspectives, I was able to actually grow from that and also uh, understand that just like with life, philosophy, and religion, that it's not all black and white. There's this gray area that you have to kind of meet um, and go from there. But while you're a teenager and under your parents' like household, there's only so much gray that you can see, and so luckily nothing happened or nothing too bad happened where I got to grow from that. And I think that's also another reason why I want to help students because I understand that it's a lot to navigate and also kind of understand because society has certain roles or ideas or perceptions about you and how you want to be or present. And sometimes it's good to have another person or perspective to be presented so that you can kind of break away with it, but without judgment. Because then that's the hard part too. Because then if students decide to change their major or tell me that this is not what they want to do, then I listen, but I also need to tell them that you have to look at what other options you have. And so one of my favorite stories for advising is that I had a Vietnamese immigrant, 60-year-old mother studying biochemistry while I was advising. And she was there before I started. But when she met me, she always requested me. And she was like, hey, I can speak English, but it's easier if I can speak Vietnamese with you. And um, I just want to talk about my degree plan. I also want to tell you that I'm doing this so that I can prove to my daughter that I can do it. Being an immigrant, being having language barriers, having the age barrier and everything. And so she actually graduated and she gave me a hug while she left. And like I told her daughter too, I'm like, if your mom can do it, you can do it. And her mom really didn't want to do anything else with that biochemistry degree except prove the fact that she can do it. And um, I really like that because then, I mean, I don't know if she really wanted to go into the work field anymore because then she's already past that age and everything. But she also wanted to just make sure that she could prove it to herself and to prove it to her daughter, because then her daughter had every advantage more so than she did in order to do better. And then I also see that with my family too. I think my parents don't have as many things on their resume as I do. One, because they're humble, and two, because uh, they don't need that validation because they already are good, intellectual, and committed people that I became who I was.
Yeah. Did your parents or any other of your family members, like your siblings, know what you were going through?
My siblings did. My brother was the first one I came out to in my generation. And we had a good conversation because then it was kind of more of a logic based argument. Because then he was a little weirded out by first. Because then, since we were a year apart, we lived in, we shared a room together. We never had our own individual room because our sister had her own room since she was female and she needed her own privacy. And so my brother was a little freaked out, but my brother had some time to think about it and then asked me eventually, he was like, "How do you not like girls?" And I said, "How do you not like boys?" And he's like, "I don't." I'm like, "I don't." And then he was like, "Okay." Kind of understood it. So that was really cool. I really like that. My sister, I came out a little later, but another fun kind of thing that came out of that was that even though we're 5 years apart, we kind of liked boys around the same time. So we went through a lot of life stages and chapters and moments together. Even there was a little bit of an age difference. It was not an experience difference. And so some of the cousins were fine, but all the cousins, and my siblings included, understand that the older generation is just the way they are. Yeah. And so, an analogy I always use with my family is that, with especially talking to Western or more of the, oh, well, Western, yeah, more Western folks, is that like my parents' generation, aunts and uncles, are kind of similar to a lot of white folks' grandparents' generation. They they are kind of in this different timeline and era that they just don't always understand or can grasp on the whole progressive perspective on how that works. And so it's kind of interesting because I think some uncles and aunts are pretty accepting, but unfortunately, it really doesn't matter whether or not my uncles and aunts are accepting, because it really matters to me whether my parents are accepting. Because then, in that same interdependence and collective view of Asian families, is that like, why are you not in med school when your cousin went to dental school, or your cousin is now a lawyer? So it always become these family dynamics that aren't really meant to pit each other against us or pit us against each other, but it's also kind of this competitive game where who is better. And unfortunately, the gay card is always used as a detriment than actually a positive. Uh, and I think, luckily, knowing my cousins and I all understand that since we grew up and was born here. But the cousins from Vietnam that came over here, uh, we have a little bit of divide because then I can't share too much with them and be too close, unfortunately. And it's kind of interesting dynamics, but it's also kind of just how Asian perspectives work. And I also tell people where the dynamic is you don't tell your parents everything. Yes, you want them to be your friends, but in Asian families, it also is even more so that you still have this power divide where you want to respect them and you you want respect from them, but you can only get respect if you treat them to the standards that their culture and their background and upbringing was. Because then me being friendly to them or being too friendly to them is already a disrespectful act and unfortunately not an honorable one. And so uh, sometimes it's kind of sad that I have to withhold some of my, I guess, accolades or accomplishments, but it's also because I don't want anyone else in the family or in their social circles to use that against them because of who I am.
Um,
I hope
so
that made sense.
yeah, it does. So that I also see that you got a BS from University of Houston for health, and you also are currently seeking a degree in psychology, which
Yeah.
is very impressive. But is there a like particular reason that you were seeking or pursued both degrees?
So I thought about doing another master's or a PhD. I actually told my parents I would do a PhD because then when I graduated with my master's, my parents were very much Asian stereotypes. So they said, "Why don't you get a PhD so you can be some kind of doctor?" Um, Very passive aggressive, very and very kind of expected. But the nice thing about working for higher education sometimes is that there are some perks. And so they give you a scholarship at for $1,500 or $2,000, and it covers about 2 classes a semester. And so being a proponent or liaison of education, I thought it would be best to also prove to students that yes, I understand that if you have to work and go to school, then but you still have to commit and do well because then life doesn't get any easier. It's all about challenges, and once you overcome some of those challenges, you can do better. And so um, I looked into some other programs, and I saw this health degree. It was great because a majority of it was online, so it helped with working full time and also with some of my volunteer work. It was good to kind of integrate into my schedule and also work out and also be a better example for students on how that um, goal oriented or task management works. And so it was kind of nice. And I took advantage of that scholarship that they provide for UH. Not everyone takes advantage of it. So it was kind of it's an opportunity. I looked at master's programs and some master programs required a GRE score. My GRE scores were expired. So I just looked at bachelor's degrees. And then I found this health degree. I really liked it. I thought about doing the master's in public health 4+1 option. Decided not to do it because then there's just a lot going on in life personally. But then part of the degree plan was also an internship. So it actually was a great opportunity where I worked with a nonprofit organization and worked with Down syndrome kids. So my nephew, on my brother's son, is actually autistic on the spectrum and is epileptic. And so, um, as much as I liked medicine, or at least being cognizant of health issues, it kind of helped in social matters. And so, this Down syndrome nonprofit, Gigi's Playhouse, was actually a great opportunity to really be more uh, open and aware of what children go through. And most children is kind of cool. Like another thing about education that I liked on my end was that I taught kindergartners in Thailand. And so I liked kindergartners and I like higher education with college students is because there is this kind of yearning to learn. And so when students are more apt on what they want to learn or learn about themselves or learn about certain subject matters, it kind of brings a lot out of them on who they are. And so it's really cool. And I know I have a counseling degree from APU, but then I know things have changed or the idea or perception about mental health and illness is very much more changing and ever evolving with our community. So I decided to get this psychology degree because then when I finished my health degree, I was only 10 classes away from finishing the psychology degree. So why not? Especially since I have this opportunity with the scholarship. I still will probably get another degree. Um, After the psychology one because I'm a glutton for punishment, apparently. But it's also I kind of hate to say it, and I kind of hate that this kind of an ideology of our society nowadays is that like with social media and with some of these like online platforms that we have, the notion is pix or it didn't happen because then people can just say whatever they want or kind of claim whatever instance or kind of superiority or accomplishment they want. But all in all, it really does still fall into proof. And so I think having multiple degrees and also kind of clout is where I can reach out to my students better. I know a lot of another influence of why I got additional degrees is because being Asian, uh, we age kind of well. There is a saying that Asian don't raisin. And so, starting out after my grad program in 2010, I was in my mid 20s, and students that I interacted with were still a little bit apprehensive of really getting my advice or information because they thought I was quote unquote too young or not qualified. And so um, I think as a society, we are very visual. We are also very quick on sizing up our community or interactions with folks. And so, unfortunately, it does kind of come down uh, to to accolades and also things on paper. And so, I do have my degrees on my wall at work, and students kind of see like change a little bit of their demeanor when they come see me. Because then at first they are like, "You look like a student." I'm like, "Thanks, but I'm still your advisor." And so that has been some of the topics and issues also when I was in my grad program about Asian American college administrators, because there is an ageism aspect to it too. And I am in my early 30s, and I still feel like students still see me as a student, which is nice because there is that familiarity with looking like a peer. But then there's also that wall or obstacle that they can't always take you too seriously if they think you are the same level or plane on them. And so it's kind of interesting. So I had to exemplify myself better. And then that's why I get these additional degrees. And also, since the university encourages it with this scholarship, then why not take advantage? And so I think that helps. And that also is a good outlet for myself because then that was the same with the LGBTQ community. Because then my background story, my family background, and everything else that came of it, it's not uncommon to a lot of gay folks or gay male Asians that I've met. But sometimes it's good just to have an example to be out there so that they can improve or be better. Because then I know younger generations are still having to fight that kind of fight, and also seeing where they are in their identity. Because then there are a lot of intersectionalities and multiple complexities about what you call your personhood, and kind of gaining traction from there in the foundation.
Yeah. So with your long history
Sorry,
of
that was so long-winded.
no, that's good. But with like this long history of education, and as you continue to pursue degrees, would you say you learned more things about yourself through this process?
Say so, but I would also say, um, like we see with COVID-19, that like everyone that watches a YouTube video or sees an article becomes somewhat of a semi-expert, and that's unfortunate. And I think also, even my friends that have higher postgraduate degrees, you kind of get into this rut that like you knew so much then, but things change, and information is always going to adapt and evolve the field of work you're in. And so it makes sense to kind of go into it. I had a friend of mine that's really close to me that took a class with me in my health degree, and he was a pharmacy technician. And we took a test together because it was an online class. And he was like, the answer is C, because new research has says that this product is more advantageous to da 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 da. And I was like, well, I get where you're coming from. I've read that article. I know the information, but we're being tested on the book. And the book and research and the peer reviewed stuff says the answer is B. And we went through this argument, and then it was kind of fun and kind of interesting to kind of go into this argument, because this is his first degree while this is my third. And he was like, well, the answer is C. I'm like, yes, you can answer C and then argue with the professor and then see where it goes from there, but I'm going to tell you the answer is B, and the B answer will give you grades automatically or points automatically. um, Unfortunately, we also have to talk about the aspects and progression of education, as it is a while to be published, to be reviewed, to actually disseminate the information out, to be on par with how society works. But at the same time, we don't want information that works with a smaller community or population that has been too tested out to be the end all be all um, answer for everything else either, because then that's the problem of why research works the way it does. I really like that aspect, and then I've grown and still continue to, and also see more relevant um, studies and case studies about certain situations. But I know it evolves, because then even friends that have a PhD in psychology, some of their stuff now is going to be outdated versus the stuff that we like students are learning now. And then I think it's good to kind of understand um, perspectives on the student side of what they're going through. I went through my health degree during Hurricane Harvey. I'm going through my psychology degree during COVID-19. So there is a certain level or development or evolution of my empathy as well, with how I interact with my students. But I also understand that um, society also gets competitive. Because then with my pre-med kids that I advise, let's say a school takes 20% of their application pool, and this year is a high number or record number that I've ever accepted for med school, which is great. but then 20% of 10 years ago, which was 100 applicants, is 20 students. But 1,000 applicants now in 2020, 20% is 200. So yes, you have 180 numerical value of students, but you also, looking only from the positive lens of 20%, then you kind of see hope, but then you also don't understand the fact that 80 rejected students is now 800. And so it becomes an interesting conversation to have, because then I also know that a lot of my students have parents that went through some of the same stuff that they did, but parents also giving their perspective may not always match what current times are showing.
Okay. So now we're gonna shift into questions more about your career. You mentioned that you had a brief stint as an English teacher in um, Thailand. So can you go more into specifics about how that experience was like?
Oh, I loved it. It was great. I've never been overseas, which was kind of nice. A friend of mine in the Honors College, Chelsea, was applying for the same program. And so she told me about the opportunity. I applied for it, checked it out. It was really cool. Um, Luckily, you didn't need to know Thai to actually get into the program. They'll teach you some Thai and enough basics to get by. But the biggest thing is that they wanted to make sure that you had a bachelor's degree from an accredited institution and that you were a strong student. And they'll teach you all the teaching stuff behind after that. There was 18 of us, I believe. I knew about 60% of them, which was kind of cool. So it became kind of like this extended study abroad, which I didn't get to do while studying biology. And but at the same time, it was more of an upgraded study abroad because you didn't have a professor or kind of this chaperone aspect to it. You got to choose between two schools. You either got to choose the school with the palace and teach on the royal grounds, or you got to choose a private school that had a religious background or Christian background and work with them. And so I went with the private school route because then that's what I understood or knew better. And they also paid a little bit more. Uh, the reason why the royal grounds and the top paid less is because teaching there was actually some of the perks and privilege. So you didn't need to be compensated for it. Some friends went to the royal grounds, some friends went to the private school. And then it was really cool. And I taught kindergartners at first. And so, I mean, I didn't go much into detail earlier, but I taught kindergartners at first. I taught for 3 to 4 months, or half a semester, or half a year, full semester, and got fired. So what happened was when I did phone interviews. Skype was still not as much of a strong platform as it is now, and video conferencing wasn't what we were doing like we are today. But we did a lot of phone interviews. I was selected to do kindergartners because they really liked my background in biology. They liked that I had a little bit of an Asian background, but also sounded very American. And since I was teaching English, this is what they wanted. And when I showed up, apparently I was too Asian. So the principal wasn't very fond of me. Other teachers were fine. My Thai counterpart that worked with me and translated was great and really appreciated me. But the principal really had this certain stigma or uh, perception that she wanted with an English teacher. She thought that's what parents wanted. They wanted this American, Caucasian person to kind of emulate or present themselves with their English teaching skills. And so eventually, the principal just found every which way and any reason to actually fire me. And so I got fired. But since I was going through the Baylor program, they were also able to find me a replacement, another kindergartner gig with another school, but that was across town. So I would be away from other Baylor friends. Um, but luckily, I was actually doing tutoring an after school program with primary school kids and at the second grade level. And the primary school principal found out, heard what happened, and was like, I heard what happened in kindergarten. I don't care. My second graders like you. If you want to stay at this school, I have a fourth, fifth, and sixth grade position open if you want to teach them. It's not your age group, it's not what you signed up for, but you get to stay in the same school, you get to stay with your Baylor counterparts, and go from there. And so I tested out the other school for kindergarten. Um, it was fine, but it was just kind of weird not having my peers or the people I came over with at the same time. Uh, but I got to check out fourth, fifth, and sixth grade. During lunch, I got to see my Baylor counterparts, and so it became a fit. I really liked it. I helped them out, and then also some holidays and some weekend programs. The other Baylor folks got to share or invite others to come over and volunteer and participate. So I still got to go on the Royal grounds and got to do stuff with them, and they got to do vice versa. It was really cool, but it was also a good lesson on cultural or internal discrimination because um, other friends that came through the Baylor program, there was one other Asian girl who's Korean, and there was another Asian female, and she was half Filipino. And so it was interesting because then my Baylor counterparts really got to see or understand some of the cultural differences and also kind of the, I guess, this like, the word discrimination that we had to deal with. Even though I was very much American, I was still seen as too Asian to teach English. And that was a good lesson and good experience to go from and also understand because then that's how my parents are a little bit. And other family members and other family units that I've interacted with, I was just like, okay. The only sad part is that when I taught my fourth, fifth, and sixth graders, is that sometimes I ran into my kindergartners during recess, and one of my kindergartners were like, "You don't love us anymore. You left." I'm like, "No, that's not it." I can't explain
Right,
like
right.
adult politics about how they feel about their teachers being not American enough to teach English. So um, I had to go from there. But at the same time, I learned a lot, and I was glad that I was over there because I learned cultural differences and also kind of the universal aspect that body language and personality really like convey itself more than any other spoken language. So one of my Baylor friends and former roommate lived in China. And so I went to Beijing and visited him for a week. And it was really funny because he's Caucasian, brunette, blue eyes, and but speaks fluent Mandarin. And so when we take a cab or whatever, they're just like, ni hao, da 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 da. And I'm like, I don't know, talk to the white guy. And then he goes off in their tangent and conversation. And he had a learning moment too, and it was really funny because he's like, I'm tired of having the same questions. They always ask, why does he not speak Chinese? Why do you speak Chinese? What is he if he's not? And then there was another fourth question, and then I said, "Well, welcome to being Asian American," because when I grew up, those were the questions I got. Where are you from? Where are you from? Or what's your nationality? Or where's your parents from? And then so you kind of had this like script that you always had to go by. But he actually learned a little bit from it too, which was kind of fun. And it was kind of where we bonded as friends even closer. And so I'm still friends with him to this day. I appreciate him for that. But it's just so funny because he never had to really understand that since he was a Caucasian male living in China through his high school years and then coming over to the States. But then when I came over, he actually had a different experience when I came over.
So on your resume, you also mentioned being an academic advisor for multiple years at the University of Houston. So how has this position kind of shaped your view of academia? Academia.
Mhm. I think it's always changing because then I went to two private schools with Baylor and Azusa Pacific. And then another reason why I got my degree in health with UH is because I needed to see the public perspective. Public school institution is going to have different hurdles and also requirements because of the fact that like it's state mandated. And so I actually had to take some basic courses that I technically had credit at Baylor, but didn't because of the fact that with a private institution, I got to learn more about the nuances between private institutions and public institutions. And so that really solidified and also strengthened me as an advisor because then students, like I said, with the whole aspect of like Pixar didn't happen, like not to have a degree in a public institution, you can only speak so much of it, even though you might have a master's. And so I got to understand the perspective where students were coming from, because then if you're a chemistry major, why do you have to take so much history and then or government classes or an extra creative arts? And so, but I understood the actual foundation of why the educational program and structure of a undergraduate degree worked. And so I could explain it better. Because then in our biology program, we actually go up to Cal 2 and even Cal 3 if you want to go that far. And some students are like, med schools don't require this much math. And then I explained to them that it's not because that you're going to be doing complicated computations throughout your whole career. Part of the aspect is um, you can get the same answer. You can always get the same answer on the same question, but how do you get to that answer is going to be different on how you deal with it. Because and that's why we want to push or go into a structural perspective about why we push so much math. So if you ever watch the old TV show House or any other kind of uh, medical drama, there is always these symptoms that could be X, Y, and Z. So like fever, cough, and da da da. Like even with COVID-19, like the flu symptoms could be COVID or it could not be COVID. And so we want to distinguish and make sure that we can touch all the other factors and outliers to make sure that we don't get the wrong diagnosis.
Mm-hmm.
And so that's why we push so much math, because then you can still always get the same answer, but sometimes you might have to go a different route. And if you go and give the wrong answer, then it could cause complications. And so I really liked advising because uh, I thought about becoming a professor. I've taught a couple of freshman introductory courses, and um, it's fine. It pays a little bit better, but there's also a lot more expectations on lesson plans and structure, and also um, you still connect with students, but some students also get lost in the cracks. But as an academic advisor, you do more than just talk about academics. You talk about family, you talk about personal endeavors and goals and convictions and why people want to go the way they would do. Or also try to tell students how to get out of their mindsets. So there was a student I even had that was studying biotechnology and wanted to become a biomedical engineer. And so I was like, what's your end all goal? And he said, I want to build medical prosthetics for patients that might have lost their limbs or don't or grew up with a physical deformity. And my friends and my family don't know what biotechnology is as a major, but that's my goal. I'm like, well, the goal is like that major will get you to that goal. And so do you worry about your family and friends worrying what you're studying or what you actually want to become at the end? And so it's been good. I think I've gotten a lot of perspective and growth. Um, it's also kind of fun to talk to parents. There's some FERPA, Family Education Rights Protective Act issues, but once they're signed off on it or when the student gives permission, it's also kind of cool to teach some parents about the education process, especially especially being in Houston. I think I wouldn't have stayed in my position or in this category of position for too long if it wasn't for Houston, because Houston in itself has such a diverse community. And so I've seen a lot of family members that are immigrants or don't have a higher education degree or background, but still want to learn about the prospect and aspect because then they're investing a lot of money and they need to know how it goes. And so hopefully explaining it to them in a way that they can understand is also another good aspect too. Because then I think if I was just more methodical and just looking at you need X amount of hours and then this amount of GPA and then was so calculated, then it wouldn't have worked out. Because then sometimes explaining to parents routes and how society works or how academia is viewed is also a good opportunity and experience to have with this family aspect, because it's just not always one person going to school. It's family members that are wanting to support and also wanting to make sure that they get their money's worth, but at the same time also get their education's worth.
Right. So you also mentioned that you are on Mayor Sylvester Turner's LGBTQ advisory board.
Mm-hmm.
Um, how is that experience and like what do you do specifically?
So there's 49 members, and it was initiated after 2011, 2010, no, 2015, 2014, because it was right after Pulse. Pulse is a gay club in Orlando, Florida. It was attacked by someone with an automatic rifle, shot down 49 people. And so that's why we created the organization or the board. And so Houston wanted to represent and show solidarity because then could have happened to anyone. And the one piece that really took it home to me was that Pulse happened midnight of June 12th. And my birthday is actually June 11th. And so if it happened in Houston, if we were rolling over past mid into the next day at one of the Montrose or Houston gay bars, then it would have been probably my friends and myself being involved in that kind of situation if it wasn't in Orlando and it wasn't Houston. So it, with my background in student government and also now in higher education administration, it shows that being involved really means a lot because then your voice needs to be heard. You might not always think that your voice is serious enough or influential enough, but it can be for a certain population and it makes the most sense. And more and more, while I get involved with the LGBTQIA community here in Houston, we have a strong Asian population. And we actually have a good number of those that identify as LGBTQIA, but involvement and representation are not there. And so I got approached to join and apply. And so after my work with Pride and Bunnies on the Bayou, which is another nonprofit, and so I thought it would be a great opportunity. And so now I'm a co-chair for the communications committee, and we want to work more on visibility and also highlighting different community members of all different backgrounds. And so I think it's great. It's cool that we kind of have this political figure that will listen and also have our lending ear, but we also go on topics outside of LGBTQ also. If we talk about homelessness, 40% of homeless youth is LGBTQ, but doesn't mean that we can't not overlook the homeless population and see what issues they have. And so there's hate crimes based on race. And sexuality might be a factor, but we also have to talk about that too. And so it's a cool group of 49 or less right now, folks, because we're got some people rolled off from their terms because each position is about a 2-year term, and then we will replace or add more people later. But right now with COVID, we had to take a break. But it's kind of cool, and we're working on a lot of issues. There is a push for more mandatory training for all Houston personnel about LGBTQ and sexuality awareness. And then we're also working on policies and procedures to hopefully be more open. With COVID-19, they're looking for blood donations, but there is an old policy based on the American Medical Association that if you're gay, then they won't take it. Because that was something initiated in the 60s, because then AIDS was a big pandemic for the LGBTQ community, and they wouldn't take gay blood because they thought I might have AIDS. And to this day, they still won't, and they haven't really adjusted the policy. They've adjusted it a little bit, but you have to be celibate for a year or have no sexual activity for a year. They lessened that a bit for COVID, and it has to be like 3 months. But if straight people don't have the same parameters, then there really isn't much equity or substantial argument why we should hold true to those policies because you answer one or two whether or not you have had physical interactions with someone of the same gender.
So you are a volunteer for various LGBTQ nonprofit organizations such as Bunnies on the Bayou, UH LGBT Resource Center, and Pride Houston. So what have you taken away from being a volunteer at these organizations?
Like I said, visibility is big. I also think it's pushing yourself outside your own comfort zone, because then I might be only one letter within that whole LGBTQ spectrum rainbow, but there is a lot more things that you can learn from and grow from. So last year, while volunteering for Pride, they do a fashion runway show each year to help fundraise money and also highlight some of our designers and companies or small businesses that work with the LGBTQ community. And last year I got to wear a wedding dress. It was the first time ever. It's probably the only time ever. But it was fun. It was cool. It was interesting. Um, it was definitely something out of my comfort zone, but at the same time, it was also for a good cause. But then also, it gave good perspective on like what's expected out of males. Like, I don't see myself less as a male or more as a male because of the fact that I wore a dress. But I was also supporting our community because then I think that also with people in the LGBTQ community also coming from another underrepresented group or community, you kind of understand that there isn't so much this um, box that you can put yourself into too much. Because then other Vietnamese Americans, even my older brother and my younger sister, we don't always have to follow the same guidelines to be more or less Asian or more or less who we are in like as a community member. So it's really cool. I got to uh, do that. I've gotten to meet many people throughout that because of those opportunities. Because then I think people also appreciate when you put yourself outside your box and also are not too judgmental about it. Because then I think that's the same with some of my friends that were at Baylor with me, live in Thailand, got to understand more Asian culture and Asian food. And the same with friends here in Houston when we go to Chinatown or Bel Air and they get to try out different cuisine, also celebrate different events and celebrations. So, and also on the other end for me, like where I get to go to the Italian Fest, Greek Fest, and kind of see more culture and understand their perspective as well.
Do any one of these organizations stand out to you in particular?
I really like Bunnies on the Bayou. I've been with them for 3 years. Uh, they are a nonprofit that started out with a group of friends celebrating Easter. And during Easter, um, it was 41 years ago. And so during Easter is a big religious holiday. And so a lot of people that were rejected from their families because of the religious perspective still wanted to celebrate Easter and also hang out with each other. So they started hanging out each Easter because they knew they couldn't be with their families. Then they eventually evolved and started uh, raising money for charities and organizations within the community. And it grew from there. And then this organization has donated over $1 million throughout its conception or more. And to this day, they still really don't use a lot of the money they raise to towards themselves. Like everyone is all volunteer based. None of the members get paid. We don't even have really a standstill office, and it's a great organization with a lot of people that want to just to like contribute to the community, and it's kind of fun because then Pride is fun. I really like Pride. Pride I've been with for a while too, but Pride is pretty standard for all communities and without the United States, throughout the United States. But Bunnies is very specific with Houston and very specific with Easter, because then not many other gay communities or LGBTQ communities do a lot of big Easter events like we do for Bunnies in the Bayou.
Okay, so we're gonna move on to kind of like additional topics and kind of like identity. So, how supportive would you say your family is, and how important was this like support for you?
Overall, my family is pretty supportive. My brother and sister are the most supportive. My parents, there is a caveat with the whole LGBT thing, but I understand. and it makes sense. But it's also disheartening or discouraging. And so it's fine, but at the same token, I can't be too upset about it because then I also know what sacrifice and um, I guess hurdles they had to go through, and I can't be too upset about it. All in all, I could just come out again, probably get disowned, um, and or disregarded as a family member. But with Asian culture and filial piety is a little bit a hard line to toe because in the actual event that they get older and need support, I want to be there for them. But if they don't take my support, then where am I as a son or as an offspring? And so that's kind of the choice I have to make, and then I get it. Um, no matter what, I know they were supportive growing up. I didn't feel like I was ever without, even though we were uh, labeled and considered low socioeconomic. I never grew up that way or felt that way. Uh, some people say, like I said, that I was deprived as a child, but I felt like most of my childhood was still pretty positive. And then so in the eventual uh, point that they get older or need assistance, then I want to be there for them. I could probably give money to my siblings and circuitously give it, they'll give it to them and support. But I think that's more hassle than it's worth. And so at this point, I'm okay with where we're at. I just know the support. I know that all in all, it's because they love me and they want to support me. It's just that they just don't really support the lifestyle that I have or identify with.
Mm. Um, yeah, so you mentioned in your bio that you value the idea of self-discovery through education. Can you elaborate some more about like this idea?
So I think with the Socratic method of like an unexamined life is not worth living is that uh, sometimes you need guidance and also uh, a a mentor sometimes with learning how life works. So learning about abnormal psychology or even having that internship with Down syndrome students or kids and adults, um, and also learning health disparities about our system really makes you more aware about global and national and local issues. Because then in my health class, I learned about health disparities, about Asian communities, because let's say X Asian population gets more heart disease than another. But the ex Asian community is all Asian communities, so Southeast Asian, Russian, like so that really uh, becomes this blanket conversation or statistic that doesn't really focus on every nationality. So that's something to keep aware of and also kind of need to break down because then Indian folks might not have the same health issues as uh, Cambodian folks. And then having historical context about certain things also is where we need just to grow and learn. And then like abnormal psychology is about like bipolar issues and like psychological issues that back in the day, bipolar was more of a negative characteristic or connotation, but it's actually just a medical issue that people need to be aware of and not demonize and while working with others and also working with their friends and whatnot. Because then uh, having so much of a negative stigma doesn't help people be more open about it. Because one of my close friends from Baylor is actually bipolar, and um, came out a while ago, and then I was able to be a little bit more receptive about his medical condition.
Um, so I heard that you sleep around midnight and wake up around like 6:15 a.m. So how did this schedule like come to be? And have you ever had a day when you felt like just exhausted or anything like
There's a couple of days, but then it's also nice that I think while growing up and kind of avoiding some of the LGBT identity stuff, like I kept myself busy so that I wouldn't have to be too much in my thoughts or um, too dwelled in my own introspection. But it's good because then I still have time to now do that. But also, um, I guess it becomes a domino effect once you become involved in one organization, another organization wants to get your input and assistance also. And so it's kind of nice also to be viewed as so much of a resource and I guess um, asset to the community that motivates you to do more. And then some of the lack of sleep is sometimes missed, but it's also nice that sometimes some of the volunteer work or even work itself doesn't always feel like work.
that? So, um, throughout this journey, would you say you have like had any regrets looking back?
Uh, yes and no. When if I decided to do the health field, I would probably done nursing. But my parents thought nursing in the early 2000s and late 90s was more of a female position. And so if I actually went into healthcare, I think I would have been a great nurse. But unfortunately, that is not the way the cards played out or how life worked. I could still probably go into nursing, but is that something I want to do? I don't know. And I would probably get a better paying gig versus education. Um, I don't know if I would be as involved in the community though, because then I would be busy working in healthcare. Um, I am glad I have this other LGBT identity because then I would be I don't know if I would be as close to my siblings or even other community members or have the friends that I have. So is something there. And then I still have never regretted going or moving so much because it really made me a stronger friend and also companion to others. Because then I understand how certain relationships can be fleeting or short lived. Because that was also something either in the Asian community or Vietnamese community with the war, and also in the gay community with AIDS. And so uh, I think that's also another incentive or motivation of why I get involved and um, do do more for the community because then uh, you never know if tomorrow is ever promised.
Right. Okay, so last question before we get to the COVID
Uh-huh.
question. So, what is one thing you would tell yourself, like when you were younger, or maybe even to kids now?
Uh, I think it's never too late to learn or continue learning.
Mm,
Um, it's okay to defy certain authorities or figures in your life as long as you know you're doing good for others. Uh, Embrace certain friendships, but also learn not to be taken advantage of by others. Then I think that's the hard part of distinguishing that. And then also, if you're in a place where you're unfamiliar or more vulnerable, then it's easy to fall into any kind of certain sense of safety. Then sometimes that gets you in trouble. My dad actually has been robbed like twice at gunpoint, and one time he gave them everything and still got pistol whipped and ended up in the hospital. So he does have a distrust in society. Um, I don't have that same kind of distrust, luckily, but I do understand where he's coming from. Uh, I do keep people at a safe distance, but sometimes letting others in that you can trust makes a big difference.
All right. So finally moving on to the COVID situation.
Yeah.
So how has COVID-19 like personally impacted your life?
Luckily, education hasn't been hit too hard. It's interesting to work remotely. Everyone's getting a little bit more tech savvy compared to our professors. So that's interesting. I think the uncertainty about how this sickness disease is treated is where the most angst comes from and anxiety, because then there's not really a vaccine or uh, uh, a a certainty where if you get it once, then you're done because you can get it a second time. Uh, I know my age and my status would be okay, but worrying about family members like my grandmother or anyone older or being asymptomatic is um, worrisome. And so overall, I'm fine. My friends are fine. My siblings are fine. But I do worry about the older generation and then being a factor or being a cause if they do get sick.
So how do you think the pandemic has revealed like social inequalities in our society, particularly maybe in the field that you specialize in?
Well, with education, it's yeah, you already saw that a little bit while talking to students as an advisor, but then when students have to go on their own resources, students, not all students have their own computer or access to Wi-Fi, and then public places that are closed, like libraries and stuff like that, where people can't congregate, it really starts showing the inequities of where access and privilege is, unfortunately. And um, then also relying on certain job positions or financial securities is not there. So that's tough. Some people may have family members that they can rely on, some people don't. And then it's interesting because then you have to have a certain level of empathy, but then you also have to be a certain level of respect and um, congruence with academia, because then students that pass classes now or given a free pass may not have the foundation to move forward, and that doesn't really help them in the long run. At the same time, and same token, you want to make sure that their circumstances are taken into consideration. But unfortunately, with the STEM field, with science, technology, engineering, and math, um, there is a lot more at stake with accuracy and precision, with calculations and measurements. So um, it's a tough uh, give and take on how to deal with students like that, and also to make sure that they're not being punished for the circumstances that are in.
So finally, how has the pandemic impacted the perceptions of the Asian American community? And have you personally felt like targeted during this whole COVID?
I think it has been pretty negative. It reminds me of other aspects of World War II and the internment camps. So everyone gets kind of the same with the health disparities. Um, Example is that everyone gets lumped in together, and so yes, it came from China, but then all Asians are Chinese, and then so no one wants to take anything at everyone doesn't want to take enough precautions on how to equally treat people, because then that's the same with other people of color and other underrepresented groups, because then all Black people are so and so, or all Latinos are so and so. And so Asian Americans have been treated even more unfairly because there are certain stipulations or stigmas or misunderstandings or not enough exposures to different races to know better. In Houston, I think we're a little bit more fortunate because there is such a strong Asian population. In other smaller communities, not so much. Because then there was an incident in Odessa, it was in Texas, but it was in Costco or Sam's Club where someone was attacked for just being Asian and thinking that they were carriers, and so that's unfortunate. I have not personally felt that. I think I've gotten a few weird looks, but I don't know whether or not it's because people are just being cautious or not. I know some of those same feelings came up when I was younger, because then there is always this certain sense of otherness. Um, but I haven't personally seen or had any instances where I felt that I was being targeted because of COVID 19.
All right. Well, that's all the questions. Thank you so much for your
You're
time.
welcome. Thank you for having me and interviewing me. This is
Yeah.
a cool opportunity.
Yeah. I think we'll send you like a follow-up email after this, sometime shortly after the interview.
Okay.
Yeah,
If you guys need anything else, you have my contact information, and then I can go from there.
for sure. Yeah. All right. Have a great rest of your day.
You too.